I stepped into the Grand Hotel lobby, briefcase in hand, ready for the work conference I'd flown across the country for. My phone buzzed incessantly, texts from my mom claiming Grandpa had a medical emergency. Panic clawed at me, but a part of me hesitated. Something felt off. At the check-in desk, a clerk casually mentioned, "Your parents handled everything for you?" I froze. My mother had signed papers, booked transfers, and kept me in the dark. The words hung in the air, casual but cutting, like a knife hidden in plain sight. Around me, colleagues chatted, oblivious, but I felt their curious glances, as if I had stumbled into some secret I wasn't meant to see. The hotel, the luxury, the trust one thought I had, it all suddenly felt like a stage, and I was the punchline. I'm Ashley, and I've spent my life balancing expectations I never asked for. Growing up in a wealthy family should have meant comfort, but for me, it meant silence, ignored while my brother thrived. Now, even thousands of miles away for work, I'm dragged into their schemes. How did family loyalty become a weapon against me? I can't ignore the warning signs any longer, but patience has its own power. Watching, waiting. I'm learning that sometimes the quietest voice sees the clearest truth. Ever since I can remember, my life in a wealthy American family felt like an endless balancing act. My parents adored my brother, praising him for every little achievement, while my own accomplishments were met with polite nods or, worse, ignored entirely. I was the responsible one, the quiet observer, the girl who handled her work, emotions, and obligations without complaint, expected to maintain appearances, handle problems silently, and never disrupt the family's image. I poured myself into every project, every opportunity, proving my competence to colleagues, friends, and even myself, but at home, it never seemed to matter. Birthday celebrations, family trips, investments, even our grandfather's estate, all orchestrated to favor him. Meanwhile, I was left to manage my disappointment quietly, internalizing the message, my worth was secondary, my opinions optional. The trust fund Grandpa set up should have been a small symbol of fairness, a way to ensure both my brother and I had financial independence, but even that became another battlefield. My parents quietly manipulated the situation, keeping me in the dark, pocketing my share, all while presenting the illusion that everything was fair. Even so, I maintained my dignity. I worked, I planned, I observed, always aware that the world outside might never see the subtle injustice, and that my own patience could one day become my greatest weapon. In this life, I had learned that silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. My mom would casually remind me that Grandpa was too old to travel, while my brother got lavish invitations to join family events. Emails from the lawyer confirming financial updates were redirected to her inbox, so I never saw them. At first, I brushed it off as oversight, maybe she genuinely wanted to protect Grandpa. But a nagging doubt refused to disappear. Then came the more blatant signs. During a conference call with family, I overheard my father discussing allocating Ashley's portion elsewhere and a hush that fell over my mom when I entered the room. Their smiles felt forced, their words rehearsed. It wasn't the open betrayal yet, it was the subtle pattern, the repeated small actions designed to exclude me, to disorient me, to keep me believing I was the uninformed one. Even friends noticed it. A colleague remarked, "You always seem to be carrying everyone else's burden," and I realized my exhaustion wasn't just professional, it was systemic. My instincts sharpened. I started quietly documenting interactions, saving emails, noting patterns. Each small lie, each manipulative gesture, was a clue, and I sensed that one day, all these fragments might form a picture too clear to ignore. The warning signs were there, persistent and undeniable. And though I couldn't yet see the full extent of their deceit, I knew I had to remain calm, patient, and observant. The stage was set, the players unaware that the quietest person in the room, the one they thought powerless, was slowly piecing everything together. The pattern became impossible to ignore. My parents grew bolder, confident that I would remain silent. Calls from my mom claiming urgent family matters, Grandpa's health emergencies, piled up, each one pulling me further from work and friends. My questions were deflected, my concerns minimized. "It's just a precaution," my father would say, his tone casual, as if my opinion were irrelevant. Even in public, the dismissals were subtle but sharp. At a company luncheon, my parents casually announced plans to transfer the hotel reservation for me to my brother, as if I hadn't already booked and arranged everything myself. Colleagues glanced at me, sensing tension, but I received no support, just polite nods and awkward smiles. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it burned all the same. Behind closed doors, my parents whispered and plotted, assuming I was naive, unaware. They celebrated their cunning, convinced that they had succeeded in keeping me ignorant and powerless. Yet, every interaction, every carefully crafted lie, only strengthened my resolve. I noticed the patterns, memorized the inconsistencies, and quietly documented every step, every signature, every text. The dissonance between public appearances and private intentions became striking. They presented a polished front to the world, loving, responsible, and respectable, while manipulating the system to erase my rights. The audacity was breathtaking, and yet I remained composed. Each act of dismissal, each sly smirk or casual remark, fueled a growing awareness. Their arrogance was their weakness. I realized something vital. The more they believed I was distracted, the more information I could gather. Patience was no longer a burden, it was a strategy. Every slight, every misdirection, was a building block for the moment when the truth would finally emerge, unstoppable and undeniable. The more I resisted, the more isolated I felt. My parents were experts at gaslighting. Every time I questioned their actions, they painted me as overreacting, ungrateful, or imagining slights that didn't exist. Friends started to sense my hesitation, but I couldn't reveal the full story. Even a whisper of the truth would have set my parents on high alert. I was trapped between protecting myself and gathering the evidence I knew would eventually save me. Loneliness became a constant companion. Colleagues offered sympathy in passing, but few could truly understand the quiet manipulation at home. My confidence wavered, and self-doubt crept in. Was I too paranoid? Was I imagining the patterns, the lies, the deliberate exclusion? Each phone call from my mom, each vague update about Grandpa, gnawed at me, but I refused to crumble. In the silence, though, a subtle strength emerged. I observed more carefully, noted discrepancies, and refined my strategy. I realized that patience and restraint were my allies. Exposing them too soon could jeopardize everything. I reminded myself that dignity was not in reacting immediately, it was in controlling my response, holding space for truth to surface, and letting the evidence speak louder than anger ever could. Even as self-doubt nipped at my heels, I maintained composure. The exhaustion was real, but my resolve was stronger. I began to see the pattern clearly. Their arrogance made them careless, their secrecy imperfect, their confidence their own undoing. Isolation was painful, yes, but it was also clarifying. I could see the cracks forming in the facade, and I knew that one day, the world would notice them too. The silent endurance wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Every slight, every manipulation, every whispered lie was being documented, mentally filed, and stored. And when the time came, I would no longer be powerless. The truth, patient and precise, would emerge, and with it, justice. Then came the blow that made me question everything. My parents had maneuvered so carefully that it appeared I had lost control entirely. The hotel transfer for my work trip was officially cancelled, and my share of Grandpa's trust fund was declared redirected to my brother. Even my lawyer aunt, who had always supported me quietly, seemed momentarily powerless against the carefully constructed deception. The social humiliation stung more than anything else. Colleagues, unaware of the manipulation, expressed sympathy, but their glances carried an unspoken assumption that I had failed. Even within my family, whispers of poor Ashley and she overreacted spread, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had sided with them. I sat quietly at my hotel room, staring at the documents I had yet to fully access, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down. But beneath the surface, my mind was sharp. Every forged signature, every redirection of funds, every lie about Grandpa's emergency had left traces, clues that were invisible to my parents in their arrogance. I reviewed notes I had taken over months, emails I had quietly saved, and discrepancies in their stories. The apparent loss was just that, appearance. I realized something crucial in that moment. The world might think I had been defeated, but they had underestimated me. Their overconfidence, their casual cruelty, their belief that I was powerless, it was all a gift. The defeat I appeared to suffer only gave me a cover, a shield to quietly prepare the next move. The seed of awareness had fully sprouted. In that quiet room, alone and seemingly defeated, I made a silent promise: I would reclaim what was mine. Not with anger or haste, but with strategy, patience, and precision. The tide hadn't turned yet, but the first wave of justice was forming, and I would ride it when the moment was perfect. The days that followed felt endless, but I refused to collapse. I moved through my work trip with a careful composure, answering emails, attending meetings, and maintaining the appearance of normalcy, all while my family believed I was distracted, disheartened, and powerless. Every smile, every polite nod, was a mask. My real focus was beneath the surface, watching, listening, recording. Isolation had taught me to trust my own judgment, to rely on my instincts, and to find strength in silence. I noticed patterns in their communications, how my mother phrased messages, the way my father redirected conversations, even the timing of seemingly casual phone calls. Each detail added to the larger picture, revealing the arrogance and carelessness that would eventually be their undoing. I documented everything meticulously: emails, voicemails, bank records, and hotel receipts. Every act of manipulation became a piece of evidence. And while outwardly I appeared calm, inwardly I was sharpening my understanding of the situation, aware that the false defeat was temporary and that true power was growing quietly. The quiet endurance wasn't passive, it was preparation. I allowed them to believe they had won, confident that my patience and diligence would one day turn the scales. Each slight, each lie, each attempt to humiliate me became fuel for the plan forming in my mind. I didn't need to act immediately. I only needed to wait for the right moment. By the time the trip ended, I had a complete mental map of their deception. And though I still faced social doubt and personal frustration, I had learned the most important lesson: strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet, observant, and unstoppable. It was during a late-night review of emails and financial statements that everything began to click. The repeated emergencies, the redirected funds, the whispered explanations, all of it followed a pattern too precise to be accidental. My parents hadn't just acted impulsively, they had orchestrated an elaborate scheme, confident I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I traced the flow of documents, phone messages, and transactions, connecting dots I had only observed individually before. The realization hit me in waves: they had underestimated not only my intelligence but my patience. Every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to isolate me had left a trail. Their arrogance was their undoing. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of real clarity. Confusion and doubt, the companions of my silent endurance, were replaced with a calculated awareness. I understood how they operated, why they assumed I was powerless, and most importantly, how their confidence had blinded them to my quiet vigilance. Even small details mattered: a hotel confirmation email hidden in a spam folder, a bank transfer timestamp, a casual remark my mother had let slip in conversation. Each tiny piece was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of deception. I began to see not just the what but the how and the why, the motives behind every cruel, calculated act. This awareness was liberating. I no longer felt the gnawing anxiety of uncertainty. I knew my position, my evidence, and the mistakes my parents had made. The power dynamic had begun to shift, not through confrontation, but through observation and recognition. For the first time, I wasn't a passive victim. I was a strategist, silently plotting a course toward justice. I closed my laptop, exhaling slowly. Patience had brought me here. Now, armed with awareness, I could leverage their missteps, and when the moment came, every act of deceit would be exposed, undeniable and irreversible. While my parents celebrated what they thought was their success, I quietly accumulated a hidden advantage that they could never anticipate. Every document they had signed, every email they had sent, every whispered conversation I had overheard was carefully catalogued. To the outside world, I seemed distracted, beaten down, and compliant, but in reality, I was building an unassailable case. I reached out to my grandfather discreetly, explaining my suspicions without alerting my parents. He, having always respected fairness, began confirming my suspicions with subtle cues: old letters, copies of trust fund paperwork, and even hints from his lawyer that some assets had been misdirected. My lawyer aunt became another unseen ally, providing legal insight and quietly mapping every step I could take once the time was right. Every interaction my parents had, every confident assumption they made, became fodder for the plan. They were blind to my observation, blind to the fact that their deception had left a trail they could not erase. Even small miscalculations, the timing of transfers, the signatures they thought inconsequential, were pieces of evidence that would one day speak louder than my words ever could. The audience, privy to my hidden advantage, could see the irony. the very qualities my parents believed made me powerless. My patience, my discretion, my composure were the tools that would ensure my triumph. I was invisible yet omnipresent, underestimated yet fully aware. In moments of quiet reflection, I realized that this advantage wasn't just evidence, it was control. I didn't need to act rashly or loudly. Every move they had made in arrogance now lay within my grasp. The slow accumulation of knowledge, the careful documentation, and the network of quiet allies had created an insurmountable position. I smiled softly to myself, the kind of smile that comes not from victory, but from inevitability. The world outside still saw a woman under duress, but the audience understood something my parents never would: the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. And in this case, that danger was righteous and calculated. As the pieces of deception came into focus, I felt a subtle but profound shift within myself. The anxiety, self-doubt, and need for validation that had haunted me for years began to dissolve. I realized that no longer did I need anyone's approval, not my parents, not my brother, not even the silent observers at work. My strength was emerging from within, calm and unshakable. I no longer measured my worth by their acknowledgement or the small slights they inflicted. Every manipulation they tried now served as a reminder of my clarity, my patience, and my growing confidence. I could see my parents' arrogance for what it truly was: a brittle facade propped up by lies. Their attempts to control me only highlighted the power I had quietly been accumulating. This internal transformation was not loud or dramatic. There was no shouting or confrontation, only a steady, composed understanding that I held the advantage. I could act whenever I chose, but I would not rush. I had learned the value of restraint, of timing, of allowing others to reveal themselves through their own mistakes. My composure had become a weapon, my silence a shield. I also began to recognize a deeper truth: power doesn't come from vengeance, it comes from control, awareness, and patience. The more I observed, the more I realized that my role wasn't to fight recklessly but to guide events so that justice unfolded naturally, undeniable and irreversible. For the first time, I felt truly free. Not in the sense of escaping my parents' schemes, but in claiming agency over my life, my decisions, and my future. The external battles were still ahead, but internally, I was no longer the anxious, overlooked daughter I had been. I had become a strategist, a patient observer, a woman whose calm clarity would ensure that when the time came, the truth would emerge fully, and no manipulation could withstand it. The quiet confidence settled around me like armor, unbreakable and steady. I was ready for the next phase, not with anger, but with precision. With clarity fully settled in, I began preparing deliberately. Every piece of evidence, every overlooked detail, every misstep my parents had made became a potential lever. I mapped out each interaction, anticipating their moves, and identifying moments when the truth could surface without exposing myself prematurely. Every decision was measured; haste would ruin everything. I strengthened my network quietly. My grandfather offered subtle support, ensuring I had access to legal documents and confirming the trust fund's details. My lawyer aunt provided discreet guidance, highlighting vulnerabilities in my parents' schemes and suggesting avenues that could make their fraud impossible to defend. No one outside this circle would know, yet I was no longer alone in my vigilance. I also honed my public persona. In meetings, on calls, and even in casual conversations, I projected composure and focus. To anyone watching, I was merely absorbed in work, unaware of the family drama. But beneath the surface, I was cataloging inconsistencies, identifying opportunities, and planning the sequence in which I would reveal the deception. Each lie they told now strengthened my position. Arrogance always leaves traces, and I intended to follow them meticulously. This phase wasn't about revenge, it was about certainty. I would not rely on assumptions or emotion. Every step, every action, would be calculated to ensure that when the moment came, the outcome would be complete and irreversible. My patience had transformed into strategy, my endurance had become control. In the quiet of my hotel room, late at night, I reviewed the timeline once more. Every call, every transfer, every signature was in order. The apparent defeat of the past weeks now seemed like a rehearsal for this precise moment. I felt a calm anticipation, a quiet readiness. I wasn't acting yet, but I was prepared. When the time arrived, they would reveal themselves entirely through their own mistakes. No confrontation would be necessary. The plan was set, the pieces in place, and I, finally, was in control. I returned to the same hotel where the chaos had begun, but this time, the energy felt different. The grand lobby, once a stage for subtle humiliation, now seemed almost tame in comparison to the quiet authority I carried. My parents assumed I was distracted by work, still absorbed in deadlines and emails, unaware that I had gathered months of evidence, documented every deception, and prepared for this exact moment. As I walked through the doors, I noticed the same staff who had once delivered indirect reminders of my exclusion. Their polite smiles now felt like witnesses to the unfolding shift of power. I maintained the same composure, but inside, every observation mattered. Every glance, every casual question, every miscalculated gesture from my parents was now a potential confirmation of their own undoing. In meetings with colleagues and vendors, I projected focus and professionalism, giving no hint of the personal battle simmering beneath the surface. The subtle arrogance my parents had counted on, their assumption that I would remain passive, now worked against them. They believed I was still the anxious, overlooked daughter, but in reality, I had never been more prepared. I also strategically positioned allies. My grandfather's discreet presence and my lawyer aunt's readiness ensured that every action I took had support and verification. The seemingly ordinary environment was now a controlled arena, where every lie my parents had woven could be challenged with precision, every manipulation exposed without dramatics. For the first time in months, I felt fully in my element. Silence was my power, composure my weapon, and preparation my shield. The tables had shifted, but no one else in the room suspected it yet. The stage was set not for confrontation, but for inevitable, unstoppable exposure. And when the first piece of truth fell into place, the consequences would ripple naturally, leaving no doubt of responsibility. My parents' arrogance reached a peak I had been quietly anticipating. They were so confident in their scheme, so certain that I remained powerless, that they began overplaying their hand. My mother insisted on discussing hotel arrangements and financial details openly in front of staff, assuming I would nod along, confused and subdued. My father casually boasted about redirecting funds and controlling the trust, thinking his words were harmless, private boasts. But every misstep, every careless remark, was now a trap. I had memorized timelines, documented every transaction, and cross-referenced communications. Their overconfidence was audible in their tone, visible in their expressions, and unmistakable in the contradictions between their statements and the actual records. Each moment they revealed more of their deception only strengthened my position. Even as they smiled, believing they were untouchable, I felt a quiet thrill, not of revenge, but of inevitability. The arrogance that had once humiliated me was now feeding my strategy. Every boast, every confident gesture, became evidence. The careful facade they had maintained for years was cracking, exposed by their own hubris. I maintained my calm, speaking only when necessary, and then in ways that revealed nothing of my preparation. Staff and colleagues saw no conflict, only professionalism. But in reality, every word, every gesture, every casual statement my parents made was being filed, mentally catalogued, and cross-checked. Their overreach was their undoing. By the end of the day, the pattern was clear to me. They had underestimated patience, observation, and precision. Their assumptions about my weakness and compliance had blinded them to the very tools that would ensure their exposure. The arrogance that once seemed invincible had sown the seeds of its own collapse. And I, quiet and composed, was ready to let those seeds grow into undeniable consequences. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet its impact was immediate and irreversible. I called a private meeting with my grandfather, my lawyer aunt, and the hotel management. My parents, brimming with confidence, assumed it would be routine, a discussion they could navigate with ease. Instead, every carefully hidden piece of evidence was laid bare, emails showing diverted funds, timestamps proving false claims about Grandpa's health, and documented discrepancies in hotel transfers. I spoke minimally, letting the facts carry the weight. My voice was calm, steady, composed. There was no accusation, no dramatic confrontation. The room absorbed the clarity of the truth, and my parents' smug expressions faltered. Every lie, every manipulation, every deceitful move was exposed with precision. My parents' confidence crumbled not because I yelled or shamed them, but because their own actions had built an airtight case against them. Hotel management canceled the transfer immediately, ensuring my rightful accommodations and access to the trust fund. Legal representatives confirmed the misappropriation, and my grandfather, visibly shaken, acknowledged the truth of my parents' actions. My parents tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but each statement contradicted the meticulously documented evidence, sealing their undoing. I didn't need to say more. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The power had shifted completely. They had built their empire of lies on my perceived weakness, and now the truth had turned the tables with unassailable authority. For the first time, the room felt still. No dramatic confrontation, no harsh words, just the quiet, undeniable clarity of justice unfolding. I didn't celebrate, I simply observed. The consequences of their choices were manifesting naturally. Their overreach, arrogance, and deceit were fully exposed. I had taken nothing through force, only through patience, strategy, and careful observation. As my parents sank into the realization of their failure, I felt an extraordinary sense of calm. The storm had passed, but the justice was complete. The facts had spoken louder than any argument or accusation ever could, and the reversal of power was absolute. The aftermath of the truth's release was swift and undeniable. Word spread quietly but quickly. My parents' manipulation, lies, and misappropriation of the trust fund were now exposed. The staff at the hotel, previously unaware of the full story, began treating them with a polite distance, their once assumed respect replaced by cautious acknowledgement of reality. Colleagues who had observed my calm endurance now understood the depth of my resilience, and sympathy turned into admiration. My parents, once commanding attention and unquestioned authority, were reduced to whispered apologies, defensive glances, and futile attempts to justify their actions. Their credibility, carefully cultivated over decades, crumbled piece by piece. Every boast, every arrogant remark, every sly attempt to control me became a clear record of guilt. The social hierarchy they relied on for influence was gone, replaced by the quiet understanding that their power had been illusionary all along. Even my brother, who had unknowingly benefited from their deceit, faced the consequences of association. While he had acted out of ignorance rather than malice, the records and evidence implicated him indirectly. The privileges and advantages he had taken for granted evaporated, leaving him to confront a new reality shaped by fairness and transparency. I observed it all silently, the satisfaction subtle and composed. I did not gloat, nor did I humiliate them further. Their collapse was complete simply because truth had been allowed to unfold without interference. The public exposure, the legal confirmation, and the undeniable facts had done all the work. My power was shown not in dramatic revenge but in measured patience, precise action, and unwavering dignity. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of clarity settle in my chest. The chaos they had created was now undone, their authority dismantled not by anger, but by the quiet persistence of evidence, strategy, and restraint. The room, the staff, the colleagues, even my family, they all witnessed the consequences of arrogance and deceit, and I was finally free to move forward. The days that followed were peaceful, almost surreal. The legal confirmation of my ownership arrived quietly, without fanfare, and the hotel transfer was fully restored under my name. My parents faced arrest for their fraud, and their social standing evaporated, but I didn't watch with triumph, I simply allowed the natural consequences to unfold. The storm had passed, and all that remained was clarity. I focused on rebuilding my life, my company, and my confidence. The trust fund was finally mine, not as a reward, but as recognition of what was rightfully earned. My brother, though shocked and initially resentful, eventually came to understand the truth and began to navigate his own path without the unfair advantage my parents had provided. Even the smallest interactions felt different. Colleagues treated me with genuine respect, no longer tempered by assumptions of weakness or distraction. Friends who had doubted or underestimated me now saw a version of myself I had quietly cultivated over months, composed, observant, and unshakable. I reflected on the journey and realized that my greatest victory wasn't in reclaiming the money or even exposing my parents, it was in preserving my dignity. The calm patience, the careful observation, and the quiet endurance had given me control without resorting to aggression or spectacle. I had learned that justice doesn't need to shout, it simply needs to exist, undeniable and complete. In those quiet moments, I finally felt a release. The weight of betrayal, of exclusion, of lies, it all lifted, leaving only clarity, purpose, and the knowledge that I had navigated the storm with composure. I could finally breathe, rebuild, and live on my terms. Looking back, I understand now that true power isn't loud or aggressive, it's patient, composed, and unwavering. The months of subtle observation, careful documentation, and quiet endurance were not just a strategy to reclaim what was mine, they were a lesson in self-respect, dignity, and resilience. I realized that my parents' betrayal and my brother's inadvertent involvement were reflections of choices, not of my worth. No one could diminish the value I had built in my own life, in my work, and in the trust one maintained with those who truly mattered. My strength had been cultivated in silence, and it had grown into an unstoppable force precisely because I never let anger dictate my actions. Peace, not vengeance, became my ultimate reward. I learned to release resentment, to observe without bias, and to act only when the moment was perfect. The calm after the storm was not emptiness, it was clarity, freedom, and a profound sense of justice achieved without spectacle. As I rebuilt my life, company, and relationships, I carried one unshakable truth: dignity endures, patience pays, and quiet strength can topple even the most arrogant of facades. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, silenced by circumstance. I was Ashley, composed, confident, and finally free.